the okay, we talk briefly on the distinctive features, maybe one or two, and then move on to the generation and phases of African poetry. So the next thing we want to talk about concerning the distinctive feature of an African poem, African poetry, is history, the depiction of African history, the conscious depiction of African history, which is, of course, part of the sensibilities of African poetry. You're studying African poetry, you see that it depicts the events, the major events that impacted Africa up to contemporary times. Particularly, there's the depiction of colonialism in African poetry. There's a depiction of colonialism in African poetry. And the need to counter colonialism by by most of the poets going back to depict pre-colonial period, pre-colonial time, in order to celebrate African culture. So from here we can talk about the generations and phases in African poetry. We can talk about the generations and phases in African poetry. Generations and phases in African poetry. When talking about the generation and phases in African poetry, we are looking at the evolution of African poetry, the stages of evolution of African poetry from its beginning in the 1930s, 1940s, until contemporary time. And the first phase that we need to look at is the pioneering phase, the pioneering phase. Pioneering. The pioneering phase lasted between 1931 and 1943. And those who practiced poetry at this time are called the pioneer poets. Those who practiced poetry at this time are called the pioneer poets. Pioneer poets. The word pioneer signals the beginning, the first. So the pioneer poets were the first set of poets we had in Africa. And they're called pioneer poets because they were the first to write about Africa. And we are talking about modern African poetry here. Because when you're talking about authorship in oral poetry, you're talking about authorship in oral poetry, we are talking about collective authorship. In oral literature, authorship is what? Collective. We don't have individualism in authorship in oral literature. That is, in oral literature, we hardly have a situation whereby someone can come out to claim to be the author of a particular work of art, say a folk tale. Okay? So you cannot hear someone saying, I want to tell the story titled How Tortoise Had Cracked Back by, they mention the name of the author. No, that's not author. The story is collectively owned by the community. So in all literature, we always talk about collective authorship or communal authorship. Okay? But in modern literature, authorship is very important. And the author is individualistic in nature. Authorship is individualistic in nature in modern literature. And so, when we are talking about the pioneer poets, we are talking about modern African poets who started writing poetry. And those are the pioneer poets. So the pioneering phase in African poetry is usually signaled by apprenticeship poetry. Apprenticeship poetry. Or apprenticeship literature, meaning they were learners. They were not really masters. They were beginners in some sense of the word. So the pioneer poets are known to be mostly shameless imitators of their European masters. They are known to be shameless imitators of their European masters. There's clear evidence in the poetry of the pioneer poets that they ate the poetry of the European masters. I mean, they copied the style of poetry written by the colonial masters. Remember that the issue about modern literature in Africa began with colonialism. Okay? Modern literature in Africa, in the sense that we know it today, arose from the incident of colonialism. When the colonial masters came and brought their missionary schools and started teaching are people their culture, the language, in their school system. That's when literature, as we know it today, called modern African literature, began. Though we had our own literature in the oral tradition. Okay? So when this pioneer poets started writing, they wrote in imitation of the English and other European masters. So that poetry is marked by imitation of the English poetry of the time. So the Victorian poetry or even romantic poetry. That's why some people criticize that poetry and say that it sounds like nursery rhyme because of a bad attempt at imitating the meter of English poetry. When you read some of the poems by the pioneer poet, you'll see whether they are, this is actually true. The poetic vision was not also sharp because they didn't seem to grapple with the burning issues at the time, especially the early pioneer poets. Okay? Some of them ignored colonialism. Some of them even praised the English masters. Of course, there were some of them who celebrated African culture. There were some of them who celebrated African identity. But the poetry was not forceful on the need to get rid of the colonial masters. So if you're talking about the pioneer poets, you can mention names like Denis Osadebe, I mention names like Denis Osadebe, Michael Dana, Gladys Kesley, Hayford, among others. So it's important that you get West African verse because most of the pioneer poets are there for you to read and the authors. So for now, I will just take one point by one of the pioneer poets to read. Let us see not only the theme, the thematic concern, but also the style of writing by this poet. I'm looking at Rejoice by Gladys Ketley Hayford. Rejoice. So you could pay attention to the rhythm of the poem, what the poem says, the theme of the poem, and so on and so forth. It says, rejoice and shout with laughter. Throw all your burdens down. If God has been so gracious as to make you black or brown, for you are a great nation, a people of great birth. For where would spring the flowers if God took away the earth? Rejoice and shout with laughter, throw all your burdens down. Yours is a glorious heritage. You are black or brown. Okay? So I'll take the poem again. I want to pay attention not only to the theme, race, or themes race, but also the style of the poem. Rejoice and shout with laughter, throw all your burdens down. God has been so gracious as to make you black or brown. For you are a great nation, a people of great birth. For where would spring the flowers if God took away the earth? Rejoice and shout with laughter, throw your burdens down. God is a glorious heritage. You are black or brown. So, the style of this poem is, first of all, out of tune with the time, because this one is trying to have a regular rhythm and meter at a time when poetry had moved away from such concerns. Remember that poetry in the modern period became free, so that we used free verse to write poetry in the 1930s, right? But here you have Gladys Kesley effort trying to maintain regular rhythm meter in this poem, making it sound like nursery rhyme. The tone of that style. But what thing does she raise? She raises a theme about the need for the black person to be happy about his or her skin pigmentation, trying to assert the pride in blackness as against the colonialist ideology that black was a color to be looked down upon. Okay? So and the tone of the poem can be associated with religious hymns. That is what I perceive reading this poem. It has a relation with religious hymns and it has the same tone as religious hymns. So you could see that this pioneer poets were influenced by church hymn books. Okay? And the pattern that poems according to the church hymn books that they sang in church, because most of them were Christians converted by the colonial masters. Okay? And being exposed to church hymns and nursery rhymes, they were bound to write their poems in that style. Okay? Apart that, I would like to read, in the remaining minutes that we have, a poem from another pioneer poet, and that is Dennis Osadebe. So, wrap up the class. I'll read from Dennis Osadebe his poem, Young Africa's Plea. Young Africa's Plea. Young Africa's Plea. Okay? When you pick up this book, these poems are there with more explanations and other quotes. So, but let me just read Young Africa's Plea by Dennis Osadebe. Don't preserve my custom as some fine period to suit some white historian's tastes. There is nothing artificial that beats the natural way in culture and ideals of life. Let me play with the white man's ways. Let me work with the black man's brains. let my affairs themselves serve man. Then in sweet rebirth, arise a better man, not ashamed to face the world. For those who doubt my talents, in secret fear my strength, and know I am no less a man. Let them bury their prejudice. Let them show their noble sides. Let me have untrammeled growth. My friends will never know regret, and I never want regret. So in this poem, Denis Osadebe is concerned with the theme of cultural affirmation. Denis Osadebe is concerned with the theme of cultural affirmation. Which is one of the thematic concerns of the pioneer poets. And he is reacting against colonialism and its consequences on African culture. That's why I said, don't preserve my customs as some fine curios. Because what the colonial masters did was to take our artifacts and put them in museums while they impose their culture on us. Okay? They didn't allow Africans to practice their culture, but rather they decided to preserve whatever they thought was African culture while they changed that culture with and replace it with European culture. And he goes on to say that African way of life, African culture is natural, while the European culture is artificial. That's why it says nothing beats the natural way. This is African way of life. Then he says, let me play with the white man's ways. Let me work with the black man's brain. What he's trying to say there is a kind of cultural hybridity. He should be allowed to explore the culture of the white man, but that should not be to the detriment of his own African culture and identity. Okay? Let me play with the white man's ways. Let me work with the black man's brain. Okay? Let my affairs themselves sort out. This is a kind of poetry that signals a sense of nationalism. Please write it down. This poetry signals a sense of what? Nationalism. Because the colonial masters thought that the Africans did not have what it took to govern themselves, which is why they imposed themselves on Africans to rule them. So when Sadebe writes, let my affairs themselves sort out, you could see that he's trying to tell the Europeans that Africans can rule themselves, can solve their own problems, that they don't need the colonial masters, the white man, to do that for them. Okay? I don't know whether, given contemporary situations, whether he was right or not. Okay? So, but let my affairs themselves sort out. But stylistically, I want you to note that this poem is written with the language of the previous era. Okay? For instance, you could notice in the various inversion in the poem. Various inversion in the poem. So a major stylistic divide in the poem is inversion, and this inversion makes the poem to sound like Bible verse, King James Version of the Bible. For instance, when it says, let my affairs themselves sort out, that's an inverted expression. Because that's not the modern syntax of that word. That's not the modern syntactic structure of that word. It would have been let my affairs sort themselves out, not let my affairs themselves sort out, like the language of the King James Version, language of Shakespeare. Right? So the language, the style is problematic for the pioneer poets here. So if you want to discuss the style of the pioneer poet, use the word inversion. Okay? The reordering of the original syntactic order of the word in an expression. So it makes the expression sound more archaic, right? Which is not necessarily a modern style. So when you get this text, we'll read some more poems by the final poet before we move on to another era. For now, let us end the class here. Good afternoon.